Well, didn't see that coming. He lied. Mighty Morphin Power Rangers Rita's Rewind, released in December of 2024 for Nintendo Switch and other platforms, courtesy of Digital Eclipse. And this is one of those Johnny-come-lately side-scrolling beat-em-up licensed things, aping the style of the successful and much-beloved Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Shredder's Revenge game, but not quite reaching that same caliber of charm or quality. Shouldn't be much of a surprise when you're going with the popular style of licensed stodge aping another superior work because everyone else is doing it. G.I. Joe, Karate Kid, Toxic Crusaders for crying out loud. What's next? Fucking SWAT Cats? I wouldn't mind a new SWAT Cats actually. That show was pretty sweet. But I don't want a game in this style. This is just... To understand the backstory of Rita's Rewind, what little there is that is, we need to touch on Mighty Morphin Power Rangers Once and Always, a somewhat partial reunion special of sorts released in 2023 to commemorate 30 years of Power Rangers, which I'm sure was followed by lots of great stuff afterwards. Once and Always features the return of Rita Repulsa, now under the guise of Robo-Rita, who hatches a plot to capture various Power Rangers to power her time machine that would allow her to go back in time and team with her younger self to prevent the Rangers from ever being born or something to that extent. Spoiler alert, she fails and eventually blows up. Rita's Rewind, on the other hand, has Robo-Rita succeeding in going back in time, allowing her to team up with her younger self, which prompts Zordon to recruit said teens with toots to become Power Rangers, which defeats the whole purpose of Robo-Rita going back in time in the first place, so yeah, great thinking there, Rita. What this amounts to is a retelling of the early days of Mighty Morphin, right up to the arrival of the Green Ranger, which you could have done without Robo-Rita. What Robo-Rita actually brings to the table is that you fight monsters from all three seasons of Mighty Morphin as opposed to just the first, and also, on occasion, you have these time-disrupting crystals that will rewind gameplay until you blow them up. This doesn't happen throughout the game, however, only when you're fighting the crystals. On the one hand, that's a good thing because I'd imagine the rewind gimmick happening every so often and at random intervals would be annoying after a while, but on the other hand, this is supposed to be Robo-Rita, a futuristic version of Rita Repulsa from 30 years in the future, imparting future knowledge to her younger self, and this is the best they could come up with. This opening flash animation from the mid-2000s almost reminds me of that Mega Battle game that was released for a previous console generation, which I never got to play because I didn't have any of the said consoles, though Mega Battle was supposed to grace Steam at one point and never did, probably because the game was hot garbage, but we're getting off track here. Rita's Rewind is a side-scrolling beat-em-up where you pick one of 5 Power Rangers, later 6 once you beat the main story mode, and go through a variety of side-scrolling levels where you beat up a bunch of putties, move to the right, beat up a bunch of putties, move to the right, beat up a bunch of putties, move to the right, beat up a bunch of oh wait, we got Tenga Warriors! We got Tenga Warriors in here! We got something different. Beat them up, move to the right, you get the idea. They try to vary things up by having giant putties, clown putties, punk putties, but again, 30 years from the future, all the knowledge you could impart with your younger self, all the advantages you could have given her, and this is the best you got. This plan was doomed to fail from day one. So aside from minor animations, taunts, and some vocal bits, all 6 Power Rangers play exactly the same way. Even the Green Ranger, whom you unlock after completing the main story mode and should logically stand out from the rest, is just a color swap of the existing Rangers, which is no worse a fate than what they did with poor Dragonzord. But anyway, you have a basic attack and combo thing, you have a dash attack, a dodge move, a rising attack, a double jump stomp thing, and a super meter that you can build up by beating up bad guys, and once full, you can unleash a screen nuke to wipe out all the putties or at least heavily harm all the major threats. There's some scenery to wreck, which will produce items such as health restoring food from the trash, yummy, coins that you use to spend on the arcade or something, and sometimes you'll find mementos to add to the collection and remind you of past episodes like Zack's monkey costume, power eggs, and the Wheel of Misfortune. Rita's Rewind is best described as a competent beat-em-up, which shouldn't be much of a surprise considering that it's Digital Eclipse and their track record is usually exceptional. You have controls that are generally responsive. You have collision detection that is generally solid. The game runs at a consistent pace on Switch with no hiccups or slowdowns. There are some fun boss fights on display once you nail down their patterns and behaviors. And I suppose it's kind of neat to uncover the momentums hidden throughout the game, seeing one-note MacGuffins, which ones made the cut, and how many of them you can actually recognize from the show. Even if they serve no real function, it's a collectible and people like collectibles, right? Well, that's not being honest. There's a couple collectibles in the game that unlock some minigames in the Juice Bar arcade, which you can play using the coins you collected. There's Drive Mama, an overhead driving game where you cover a certain distance before time runs out. There's Karate Chop Shop where you press the button at the right time to build up your power to chop the item in front of you. And finally, there's Nanopilot, which is a cross between Asteroids and Defender, defending the cells from the viruses and such. I'd say these are fun as a mild distraction, but truth be told, I enjoyed playing these minigames more so than the main game itself. The combat in Rita's Rewind feels somewhat clunky and sluggish. Part of that has to do with the action generally being on the slower side of things. Everything seems like it's moving in molasses. This isn't a performance issue, however, this is a general gameplay issue. And while a recent patch supposedly tweaked this to be a bit quicker, I really haven't felt the difference. With this kind of brawler especially, you want the action to be nice, quick, smooth, fluid, flowing, like water. Rita's Rewind is orange juice with pulp. Still drinkable, but not quite as smooth and with some noticeable chunks. There's no leveling up or stat upgrading system to be found here, which honestly I could care less about having, but there is a ranking system and achievements you can aim for, which should satisfy some folks, I guess, but I don't know, I'd much rather have Power Rangers that played distinctively from each other, or combat that felt a little more quick and slick. Otherwise, what does it matter if I unlock the Green Ranger if he just plays the same way as the others? On the flip side though, the game does support up to 5 players, which is neat on paper if you could gather that many people and form your own full-blown Ranger team to tackle these grunts. No online mode on Switch as of this recording at least, but supposedly there's a patch coming up that'll resolve that. That's assuming you're still playing by the time that rolls around, because once you've done everything there is to be done in Rita's Rewind, there's no real reason to go back, and the shallow gameplay doesn't really help matters either. Still, despite some minor hiccups and grievances, the main belt-scrolling segments of the game are just fine. However, when it comes to the Zord segments, So one of the contentious things with these recent Power Ranger games is how they handle Zord battles. Over the years, we went from straightforward fisticuffs to convoluted quick-time malarkey, so a general downward trend. Rita's Rewind's take on Zords is in the form of rail shooting segments akin to the old Sega Super Scalar arcade titles, where you take control of one of the Dinozords and shoot things while avoiding obstacles and collecting power-ups, which may include temporary weapon upgrades, shields, and some health pickups. With the exception of the Pterodactyl, which is a flying Zord, all the Zords play exactly the same way, and yes, that includes everyone's favorite Dragon Zord, which went from a menacing background threat to this. Sometimes instead of driving Dinozords, you'll drive motorcycles, which I'm assuming are the Shark Cycles from the 3rd season, even though there was never a Green Ranger Shark Cycle, but again, it doesn't matter. They all play the same way anyway. The levels tend to drag on for way too long, and isn't helped by the somewhat spotty aiming and hit detection that, to be fair, seemed somewhat better with the recent patch upgrade, but still not quite where it should be. I generally don't mind a good rail shooter, but these felt a little off to me. Probably my least favorite segment of the bunch, but at the very least, better than most Zord segments in other games I've played, so that's a step up at least. Then there are the Megazord fights, which act more as bonus levels because it's impossible to lose in these. These are first-person rock'em sock'em robot things where you spend most of your time chasing after the monster, dodging their attacks, and sometimes landing a few blows to build up your power meter, so you can eventually summon your power sword and deliver the finishing blow. Taking hits will cost you power sword energy that you'll have to build back. Again, a problem with these rounds is that they tend to drag for way too long, especially when your opponent has a tendency to flee constantly, which is often, so you're almost always chasing the bastard down to maybe get a couple lucky hits in before he flees again. I will say that after a recent patch, these have become somewhat more bearable, and to be fair, I actually like the idea in general. Mind you, anything that isn't QTE Wagglefest or anything along those lines is a step up, but these weren't too bad for the short term. Keyword being short term. Anything longer than that is kind of pushing it. I'll tell you this much though, the game does look pretty. You've got a nice, clean-looking pixel presentation with some nice, smooth animation and stuff, which, again, considering the style of game this is emulating, should be the bare minimum and not just something to be commended. Each of the Rangers, while they all play the same, at least have unique animations that fit their characters, and the characters featured are well rendered. You could recognize all the characters. They look like what they should. Likewise, the Zord segments do manage to replicate the feel of the old Sega Super Scaler arcade titles with the slick scaling effects and such. I'll have issues with the gameplay when it comes to the overall look of the game. Rita's Rewind pretty much has that in the bag. Well, except for the opening flash animation, that looks a little cheap, even for Power Rangers. Rita's Rewind also has some decent sound output. You've got a remixed version of what I assume is the old Go-Go Power Rangers theme that they ripped from the old movie, or at least that's what it sounds like, not featured in this video for obvious reasons. Otherwise, the background music is generally original output that sort of mimics the instrumental tunes of the first season, and generally does a good job of it, I think. I won't say that there's any one tune that stands out. After a while, it all starts to blend together, but they fit the vibe that the game is trying to capture, if nothing else. You've got sound effects that sound fine for the most part, and there are some minor vocal clips done by people who, well, at least they got paid. Let's just leave it at that. Let's leave it on a high note in that regard. Overall, Mighty Morphin Power Rangers Rita's Rewind, well, it left me a little torn, if I'm being honest. On the one hand, it's a perfectly competent, perfectly acceptable little belt scroller that will more than satisfy those Ranger fans who want that old school 5-player arcade action, and if that's the bare minimum of what you're looking for, this will satisfy, especially with the online functionality on other platforms and eventually on Switch. The unlockable arcade games are also a surprise pleasure to sample, and for those who like to collect things and achievements, there's enough of those to go around in this game. On the other hand though, Rita's Rewind is hindered with somewhat clunky combat, underwhelmingly shallow gameplay, rail shooter segments that don't quite hit the mark, for me at least, and a story concept that sounds intriguing on paper, but doesn't quite go far enough. Again, evil Space Witch from the future teams up with her younger self to change the past, should be open to many different possibilities and scenarios that otherwise would not have been possible in a straight retelling of Mighty Morphin, but instead feels like an afterthought most of the time, save for a couple rewind gimmicks that solely exist to justify the name of the game. Oh, and mining operations. Rita has mining operations now. I guess that'd be... Nah, you could have done that on an episode of Power Rangers with a monster or two. Maybe one of the Zhu 2 monsters or something. Oh well. All in all, a perfectly competent, perfectly acceptable beat-em-up for the Ranger Nation to get some mileage out of, but there's nothing here that hasn't been done better elsewhere.